The mid-morning sun cast a golden glow over Buckingham Palace, the historic facade gleaming as tourists gathered in eager clusters, their cameras clicking incessantly. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement, the air filled with voices in dozens of languages as visitors marveled at the grandeur of the British monarchy's residence. The iconic black and red uniformed guards, with their tall bearskin hats, stood stoically at their posts, embodying the tradition and discipline that had defined their role for centuries. Jessica Foster stood at the edge of the crowd, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose, a smug expression on her face, a wealthy American tourist in her late 20s. She had arrived in London with her best friend, Sarah, for what she referred to as a cultural adventure. But to anyone who had spent more than a few minutes with Jessica, it was clear she held little regard for the cultures she encountered. Her trips abroad were less about learning and more about boasting, photo opportunities for social media, and anecdotes to flaunt at dinner parties back home. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed genuinely interested in the history and beauty of their surroundings. She stood beside Jessica, clutching a guidebook, her eyes wide as she read aloud from a section about the palace. "Did you know Buckingham Palace has 775 rooms?" Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. Jessica rolled her eyes, letting out a dismissive laugh. "Yeah, and I bet half of them are just filled with dusty old furniture and pointless knickknacks. Honestly, who cares?" Sarah frowned but didn't respond. She was used to Jessica's abrasive attitude, though it often made her uncomfortable. Jessica always had a way of turning inspiring moments into opportunities for cynicism and self-centered remarks. The crowd began to shift as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. People moved closer to the gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the soldiers' precise movements. Sarah's excitement grew, but Jessica remained indifferent. "It's just a bunch of guys walking around in silly hats," Jessica muttered under her breath. Sarah turned to her, a note of exasperation in her voice. "It's a tradition, Jess. Something that's been around for hundreds of years. Can't you appreciate that?" Jessica smirked. "Tradition is just a fancy word for old stuff people are too lazy to change." As the guards marched into position, the crowd erupted into applause. The synchronized movements and polished presentation captivated everyone except Jessica. Her eyes scanned the line of guards until they landed on a tall, dark-skinned soldier standing near the front. Something about his stoic demeanor irritated her. "Look at that one," Jessica said, nudging Sarah. "The tall guy. He's taking this way too seriously. It's like he thinks he's in a movie or something." Sarah glanced at the soldier Jessica was pointing at. His posture was perfect, his gaze fixed straight ahead, unyielding to the noise and chaos around him. "He's doing his job," Sarah said, her voice defensive. "It's called professionalism." Jessica laughed. "Professionalism? Please, he's just standing there like a statue. How hard can that be?" Sarah didn't respond, sensing that any attempt to argue would be futile. Instead, she tried to focus on the ceremony, letting the pageantry and precision of the guards distract her from Jessica's negativity. But Jessica wasn't content to let the moment pass quietly. She felt an itch, a compulsion to do something that would break the monotony of what she saw as an overhyped spectacle. She wasn't here to blend into the crowd, she was here to be noticed. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jessica seized her opportunity. She stepped closer to the railings, her eyes fixed on the tall guard. "Excuse me, sir," she said loudly, her voice dripping with mock politeness. "Do you ever, smile? Or is that against the rules?" The guard didn't flinch, his face remaining as still as ever. Jessica chuckled, her voice carrying through the thinning crowd. "Come on, you're not a robot, are you? Or maybe you're just really good at pretending." Sarah's face turned red with embarrassment. She grabbed Jessica's arm, trying to pull her back. "Stop it, Jess, you're being rude." Jessica shrugged her off. "Relax, it's just a bit of fun. He's not going to do anything." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that no one else seemed eager to accept. The guard remained motionless, his discipline unshaken, but Jessica wasn't satisfied. The lack of reaction only fueled her need to provoke him further. "Seriously, though," she said, leaning closer to the railing, "what's it like being a living mannequin? Do they pay you extra for that?" Sarah's anxiety grew as she noticed people starting to look their way. Some had stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of disapproval and curiosity. "Jessica, please," Sarah whispered urgently, "you're making a scene." Jessica ignored her, too caught up in her performance to care. She felt a rush of adrenaline, a sense of power in knowing that all eyes were on her. And then, without thinking, she reached out and flicked the brim of the guard's bearskin hat. The small gesture sent a ripple through the crowd. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire as people realized what had just happened. Sarah's eyes widened in horror. "Jess, what are you doing? You can't touch them." Jessica smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. "What's he going to do about it? He's not allowed to move, right?" The guard remained still, his gaze unwavering, but the tension in the air was palpable now, a silent warning that Jessica was playing a dangerous game. Unfazed, Jessica took it a step further. "Come on, smile for the camera," she said, pulling out her phone and holding it up to his face. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their collective disbelief hanging heavy in the air. Sarah's heart raced, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. Jessica had no idea what she had just unleashed. The silence following Jessica's antics was deafening. It felt as though time had momentarily stopped, the onlookers frozen in a mix of shock and unease. The tall royal guard remained motionless, his composure as unyielding as the stone walls of Buckingham Palace behind him. Yet, beneath the stoic facade, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, an invisible line that Jessica had now crossed. Sarah grabbed Jessica's arm again, her voice a desperate whisper. "Jess, stop. Seriously, you're going too far." Jessica yanked her arm away, her laugh sharp and cutting. "Relax, Sarah, it's not like I committed a crime. Besides, this guy is probably trained to take way worse than this." She gestured toward the guard with a dramatic wave of her hand, her tone dripping with mockery. "Right, soldier boy, what's a little harmless fun compared to the Queen's enemies or whatever you're supposed to be guarding against?" Somewhere in the crowd, a child whispered to his parent, "Is she allowed to do that?" The parent's response was a firm shake of the head, their disapproval evident. Jessica, however, seemed oblivious to the growing discomfort around her. Encouraged by the attention, she decided to push even further. "Oh, come on," she said loudly, addressing the crowd now. "This guy's whole job is to stand there and look intimidating, and he can't even do that right." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, their judgment heavy. "Jess, please," she begged again, her voice barely audible over Jessica's taunts. Jessica turned back to the guard, her eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and arrogance. "You know, I bet I could get you to react," she said, her voice laced with challenge. "All it would take is the right kind of push." Before Sarah could stop her, Jessica stepped forward again. This time, she extended her hand and lightly tapped the guard on his chest, just above the polished brass buttons of his uniform. The collective gasp from the crowd was almost deafening. "Jessica," Sarah's voice was sharp now, cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. "What are you doing? You're going to get us into serious trouble." Jessica shrugged, her grin widening. "Oh, please, what's he going to do? Write me a strongly worded letter?" But even as she spoke, there was a flicker of something in the guard's expression, so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it. His jaw tightened, the only indication that Jessica's actions were beginning to chip away at his disciplined restraint. Still, Jessica wasn't done. She turned to the crowd, holding up her phone once more. "Okay, everyone, watch this. Let's see if the Queen's Guard can handle a little American spirit." The guard remained still, but the tension was palpable now. Every muscle in his body seemed coiled, ready to spring, though his training kept him firmly in place. Jessica smirked, taking his silence as permission to continue. "See? Nothing. He's like a statue. I could probably..." Her voice trailed off as an idea formed in her mind, one that would surely guarantee her the reaction she craved. Without hesitation, she reached up and slapped the brim of his hat, tilting it slightly askew. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. Even Sarah, who had been desperately trying to pull Jessica away, froze in shock. "Jessica, you've lost your mind," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Stop this right now." Jessica, however, was undeterred. "What? It's not like I hurt him," she said, her tone dismissive. "And honestly, this is probably the most exciting thing that's happened to him all day." She turned back to the guard, her grin widening. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or does the Queen have you on mute?" For the first time, the guard moved. It was a small gesture, just a shift in his stance, the slightest adjustment of his posture, but it was enough to send a ripple through the crowd. Jessica's grin faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, look, he can move. Guess I'm not the only one breaking tradition today." But the crowd's attention wasn't on Jessica anymore. All eyes were on the guard, who slowly and deliberately straightened his hat, his movements precise and controlled. When he returned to his position, his gaze locked onto Jessica, his dark eyes burning with a quiet intensity. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The stoicism that had defined his presence was now laced with something more, a sense of authority that demanded respect. Jessica, oblivious to the shift in power dynamics, took a step closer. "What's the matter? Did I hurt your feelings?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But before she could say anything else, the guard finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and unwavering. "Step back," he said, the command clear and firm. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a blanket. Even Jessica seemed momentarily stunned, her confidence wavering. "What did you say?" she asked, her tone defensive. "I said step back," the guard repeated, his gaze never leaving hers. "You are interfering with my duty and violating protocol." Jessica blinked, caught off guard by his response, but instead of backing down, she crossed her arms and smirked. "Oh, so now you can talk. What happened to all that stiff upper lip nonsense?" The guard didn't flinch. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice steady. "Step back and leave the premises." The crowd watched in hushed anticipation, their phones recording every second. It was clear to everyone but Jessica that she was in over her head. "Or what?" Jessica said, her voice rising. "You're going to arrest me? Go ahead, tough guy. Let's see what you've got." The guard didn't respond. Instead, he took a single step forward, closing the distance between them. His presence was imposing now, his disciplined composure a stark contrast to Jessica's erratic behavior. Sarah grabbed Jessica's arm one last time, her voice trembling. "Jess, please, stop. You're making a mistake." But Jessica shrugged her off, her arrogance blinding her to the reality of the situation. She raised her hand again, her intention clear. The crowd held its breath, the tension reaching a breaking point. And then, Jessica made her move. The slap echoed through the square like a thunderclap, silencing every murmur and whisper from the gathered crowd. Jessica's hand had connected with the royal guard's cheek, an act of brazen disrespect that left everyone stunned. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the guard's head turned slightly from the impact. Sarah's gasp was audible, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at her friend in disbelief. "Jessica, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The guard straightened his posture with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, his expression unreadable. The disciplined professionalism that had been his shield against Jessica's provocations now felt like a storm waiting to break. Jessica, however, was unfazed. In fact, she looked pleased with herself, her grin as wide and unrepentant as ever. "What's the matter?" she taunted, taking a step back and raising her arms in mock surrender. "Are you finally going to do something, or are you just going to stand there like a statue?" The crowd was no longer merely watching, they were transfixed, their collective breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, as dozens of people captured the unfolding drama. The guard took a slow, deliberate step forward, his towering figure casting a shadow over Jessica. The look in his eyes was one of quiet authority, a stark contrast to Jessica's erratic arrogance. He spoke, his voice low and firm. "You have assaulted a royal guard on duty. This is your final opportunity to step away and leave, or you will face the consequences." His words were measured, but the warning in them was unmistakable. Jessica laughed, her voice sharp and grating. "Oh, please, consequences? What are you going to do? Write me a ticket?" She rolled her eyes, turning to the crowd. "Can you believe this guy? Acting like he's some big deal because he wears a funny hat." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, some shaking their heads in disbelief at her audacity. A man in the crowd muttered, "She's pushing her luck." Sarah reached for Jessica's arm again, her voice urgent. "Jessica, stop. He's not kidding. You're going to get arrested." Jessica shrugged her off, her confidence unwavering. "Let them arrest me. It'll make a great story for the flight home," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. The guard took another step closer, his presence commanding and unyielding. Jessica, perhaps realizing for the first time that she had crossed a line, hesitated for a split second, but her pride quickly overpowered any sense of caution. "Go ahead," she said, crossing her arms defiantly. "Do your worst." The guard didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached for the small microphone attached to his uniform, speaking into it in a clipped, professional tone. "Assistance required at post 4. Immediate response." The words sent a ripple through the crowd. the realization sinking in that this was no longer just a spectacle, it was a serious incident. Jessica's grin faltered slightly, but she quickly masked it with a scoff, calling for backup. Really? You can't handle one tourist on your own? Before the guard could respond, a pair of police officers emerged from the crowd, their presence swift and authoritative. They moved toward Jessica, their expressions grim. One of the officers said, his tone firm but polite, "We need you to step aside." Jessica looked at them, her bravado wavering for the first time. "What? Are you seriously taking his side? He's just standing there doing nothing." The officer didn't respond to her outburst. Instead, he turned to the guard. "What's the situation, sir?" The guard's reply was precise and unwavering. "The individual in question has repeatedly interfered with my duties and has now committed an act of assault." Jessica's eyes widened, her bravado cracking. "Assault? Are you kidding me?" It was a slap, not a punch. The officer's expression didn't change. "Assault is assault. You've committed a crime." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding their heads while others continued recording. Jessica's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and indignation. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. He's just mad because I embarrassed him." The officer held up a hand, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We're not here to debate. You have two options. You can cooperate and come with us, or we will have to detain you forcibly." Jessica glanced at Sarah, who looked pale and terrified. "Jess, just go with them," Sarah whispered. "Please, don't make this worse." But Jessica's pride wouldn't let her back down. She crossed her arms and glared at the officers. "Fine, take me in. Let's see what the Queen thinks about her precious guard whining over a little slap." The officers exchanged a look before one of them stepped forward and took her by the arm. "You're under arrest for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard," he said, reciting her rights as he began leading her away. The crowd parted to let them through, their phones still recording as Jessica was escorted toward a waiting police car. As she was led away, the Royal Guard returned to his position, his composure as unshakable as ever. But as he stood there, his eye scanned the crowd, and for a brief moment, his gaze lingered on a young boy who had been watching the scene unfold. The boy's eyes were wide with admiration and respect, and he gave the guard a small, shy salute. The guard's lips twitched ever so slightly, the hint of a smile breaking through his stoic exterior. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to remind everyone watching that beneath the uniform was a human being, one who had endured Jessica's provocations with grace and dignity. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations filled with disbelief and awe. Sarah stood alone, her face pale as she watched her friend being driven away. And for the first time, Jessica was silent. The aftermath of Jessica's arrest spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with videos of the incident, capturing every infuriating, humiliating, and dramatic second. Hashtags like #RoyalGuardRespect and #JessicaUnhinged began trending within hours. The footage showed Jessica's slap and the calm yet firm response of the Royal Guard, creating a stark contrast between her arrogance and his composure. As the videos gained millions of views, the public began weighing in with their opinions. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of the guard. "Imagine slapping someone on duty and thinking you'd get away with it. She deserved that arrest," one tweet read. "Royal Guards endure so much from ignorant tourists, but this guy showed immense restraint. Respect," said another. Jessica, meanwhile, was still in a holding cell, her phone confiscated, completely unaware of the digital storm brewing outside. Sarah, seated on a bench in the police station lobby, refreshed her feed repeatedly, her stomach sinking with each new comment. Jessica had always been bold and unapologetic, but this time, she'd crossed a line, and Sarah wasn't sure if her friend could recover from the fallout. Back at the palace grounds, the Royal Guard's day continued as usual, or as close to usual as it could be after such an incident. Tourists still posed for photos, some whispering about what they'd seen earlier, others sneaking glances at the guard who had become an overnight sensation. Behind the scenes, however, the guard's colleagues and superiors were discussing the event with a mixture of concern and approval. "You handled yourself well, Simon," said Captain Morris, his commanding officer, as he reviewed the footage from a security camera. "Your restraint and professionalism were exemplary." "Thank you, sir," Simon replied, his tone steady. "But," Morris continued, leaning back in his chair, "this incident has drawn a lot of attention. The press is already asking questions. You may need to make a statement." Simon hesitated. Public statements weren't part of his job description. and he wasn't eager to step into the limelight. "With respect, sir," he said, "I believe the footage speaks for itself. My duty is to protect and represent the monarchy, not to engage with the media." Morris nodded, appreciating Simon's humility. "Fair enough, but be prepared for the possibility. This story isn't going away anytime soon." In the digital world, Jessica was being scrutinized like never before. Internet sleuths uncovered her social media profiles, exposing years of entitled behavior and controversial posts. Her Instagram, once filled with selfies and travel photos, became a battleground of criticism. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," one commenter wrote beneath a picture of her posing in front of a luxury resort. "Travel tip: don't assault the people who represent the country you're visiting," quipped another. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself caught in the crossfire. Though she hadn't been the one to slap the guard, she had been standing next to Jessica, laughing along at her earlier provocations. Some commenters labeled her complicit, and she began receiving direct messages urging her to speak out against her friend. Unable to take the pressure, Sarah finally broke her silence. She posted a brief video on her account, her voice shaking as she addressed the incident. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," she began, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't realize how far Jessica was willing to go, and I should have done more to stop her. The Royal Guard didn't deserve what happened, and I deeply regret being part of that moment." Her apology was met with mixed reactions. Some commended her for taking responsibility, while others accused her of throwing Jessica under the bus. Jessica's arrest was a hot topic in the news, with outlets around the world covering the story. Morning shows debated the ethics of public shaming, while evening programs analyzed the role of the Royal Guard in modern society. A particularly poignant segment featured a former Royal Guard who explained the discipline and sacrifices required for the job. "They stand there for hours, often in harsh conditions, representing centuries of tradition," he said. "What many don't realize is that these men and women are trained professionals. They're not just ceremonial figures, they're protectors of the monarchy and the people." The segment resonated with viewers, further tilting public opinion in Simon's favor. As Jessica sat in the interrogation room, waiting for her lawyer, reality began to sink in. The smug confidence she'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by a simmering anger. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, pacing the small room. "It was just a slap. Why is everyone acting like I committed a crime?" When her lawyer finally arrived, his expression was grim. He placed a stack of papers on the table and sat across from her. "Jessica," he said, his tone heavy with frustration, "do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, it's not like I hurt him. He's fine." Her lawyer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That's not the point. You assaulted a royal guard. That's a serious offense, and the entire world saw it." Jessica's face fell. "What do you mean, the world saw it?" He pulled out his phone and showed her one of the many videos circulating online. As she watched herself slap the guard and taunt him, her stomach churned. "This has gone viral," he explained. "You're being portrayed as the epitome of entitlement, and the public is calling for you to face severe consequences." Jessica's hands clenched into fists. "This is unfair. He provoked me." Her lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" "Because from what I've seen, he handled the situation with incredible restraint." Jessica fell silent, her mind racing. For the first time, she began to realize that her actions might have been more than just a moment of defiance. They were a mistake with far-reaching consequences. Back at the palace grounds, Simon finished his shift and returned to the barracks. As he removed his uniform and prepared for the evening, he couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. He didn't relish the attention or the drama, but he took comfort in knowing he had done his job with integrity. Little did he know, the ripple effect of Jessica's slap was only beginning, and the days ahead would bring even greater challenges and opportunities for him and everyone involved. As the legal proceedings against Jessica began, her situation became even more precarious. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to move forward with charges of assaulting a royal guard, a serious offence under British law. Jessica's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the case had become so high-profile that the authorities were reluctant to appear lenient. Meanwhile, Simon found himself thrust into a spotlight he never sought. The royal household issued a statement praising his professionalism and emphasizing the importance of respecting the guards and their duties. Though Simon preferred to keep to his routines, he couldn't avoid the attention. Reporters camped outside the barracks, tourists whispered his name, and strangers stopped him on his way home to thank him for his service. Jessica's first court appearance was a spectacle. The courthouse steps were crowded with journalists, protesters, and curious onlookers. Some carried signs supporting Simon and the Royal Guard, while others decried Jessica's actions as an example of unchecked privilege. Jessica wore oversized sunglasses and a scarf to shield herself from the cameras, but her attempt at anonymity only made her stand out more. Her lawyer walked beside her, his jaw set in frustration as reporters shouted questions. "Jessica, do you regret your actions? Do you think you'll avoid jail time? Why did you slap the guard?" Jessica kept her head down, saying nothing as she entered the building. Inside, the hearing was brief but tense. The prosecution presented its evidence, including the widely circulated video footage. The defense argued that Jessica had acted impulsively and without malice, but the judge was unsympathetic. He set a trial date, and Jessica was released on bail under strict conditions. As she left the courthouse, the media frenzy intensified. A reporter's question finally broke her silence. "Do you have anything to say to the Royal Guard you slapped?" Jessica paused, her expression a mix of anger and exhaustion. "He embarrassed me first," she snapped before being hurried into a waiting car. Her comment reignited public outrage, solidifying her image as unrepentant and entitled. In stark contrast, Simon's life continued with quiet dignity. Despite the public attention, he refused to be drawn into the controversy. When approached for interviews, he politely declined, focusing instead on his duties and his colleagues. However, his superiors saw an opportunity to highlight the values of the Royal Guard. They invited him to speak at a private event celebrating the dedication and professionalism of the force. Simon reluctantly agreed, viewing it as a chance to shift the narrative away from Jessica's actions and toward the broader significance of their role. The event was held in a grand hall, attended by dignitaries, members of the royal family, and other guards. As Simon took the stage, the room fell silent. "I stand here today not because of a single incident," he began, his voice steady, "but because of what that incident represents. The Royal Guard is more than a symbol. We are a commitment to tradition, respect, and service. My colleagues and I endure challenges daily, and we do so with pride and honor." His speech was met with a standing ovation, and for the first time, Simon allowed himself a small smile. As Jessica's trial date approached, her world continued to unravel. She became a pariah on social media, her accounts inundated with criticism. Brands she had previously partnered with cut ties, and friends began distancing themselves from her. Sarah, who had publicly apologized weeks earlier, was one of the few people still willing to speak to Jessica. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Sarah tried to reason with her. "Jessica, you need to take responsibility," she said, her tone firm but caring. "This isn't just about the slap, it's about everything that came after. The arrogance, the refusal to apologize. People want to see that you've learned something." Jessica scoffed, stirring her coffee absently. "They don't know me. Why should I care what they think?" "Because it's not just about them," Sarah replied. "It's about you. If you don't change, this will follow you forever." Jessica didn't respond, but Sarah's words lingered in her mind. The trial was a turning point. Jessica's legal team presented a defense centered on her lack of intent to harm and her history of charitable work. But it wasn't enough to counter the overwhelming evidence. The prosecution painted a clear picture of entitlement and disrespect, bolstered by witness testimonies and the viral video. Simon was called to the stand, where he recounted the incident with the same calm demeanor he had shown that day. When asked how he felt about Jessica's actions, he responded thoughtfully, "My role is to serve and represent the monarchy, not to engage in personal conflicts. What happened that day was unfortunate, but my focus remains on my duties." His words resonated with the jury, highlighting the stark contrast between his professionalism and Jessica's behavior. In the end, Jessica was found guilty of assault and sentenced to community service, along with a hefty fine. The judge also ordered her to attend anger management classes, emphasizing the need for her to reflect on her actions. The resolution of the case marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Simon and Jessica. For Simon, the experience reinforced his commitment to his role, and he continued to serve with the same quiet dignity. He became a symbol of resilience and professionalism, admired by many for his handling of the ordeal. Jessica, meanwhile, faced a long road to redemption. Her community service involved working with underprivileged youth, an experience that gradually opened her eyes to the consequences of her actions and the privilege she had long taken for granted. Though the journey was challenging, it marked the start of a transformation, one that, for the first time, allowed Jessica to see beyond herself. And so, while the slap had been the spark, the lessons learned and the changes it inspired became the true legacy of that fateful day. Months had passed since the trial, but the ripples from that day outside the palace gates were still felt. The public had largely moved on, but for those directly involved, the incident remained a defining moment. Jessica's court-mandated community service placed her in an inner-city youth program, assisting with after-school activities and mentoring teenagers from underprivileged backgrounds. At first, she approached the work with the same dismissive attitude she had carried into the courtroom. She saw it as a punishment to endure, not an opportunity for growth. Her first day was a rude awakening. The program director, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Carter, quickly saw through Jessica's reluctance. "Listen, Ms. Carter said, fixing Jessica with a sharp gaze. These kids don't need pity, and they definitely don't need someone who's just here to tick a box. If you're not going to put your heart into this, you're wasting their time and yours." Jessica bristled but didn't respond. She wasn't used to being spoken to so directly. But as the weeks went on, something began to shift. The youth Jessica worked with were a mix of personalities: shy, boisterous, studious, and rebellious. One girl, a 14-year-old named Layla, caught Jessica's attention. Layla was outspoken and fiercely independent, often challenging Jessica with pointed questions. "Why are you even here?" Layla asked one day, her tone skeptical. "You don't seem like the type to care about people like us." The question stung, but Jessica found herself unable to dismiss it. Over time, as she helped Layla with her schoolwork and listened to her talk about her dreams of becoming a lawyer, Jessica began to see her own flaws reflected back at her. For the first time, she confronted the entitlement that had driven her actions. She realized that her privilege had blinded her to the struggles of others and that her arrogance had hurt more than just the royal guard. She had disrespected an entire nation's culture and values. Meanwhile, Simon's life had settled back into its usual rhythm. The media attention had waned, and he was grateful for the return to normalcy. Still, the incident had left its mark. One day, during his lunch break, Simon received an unexpected letter. The envelope was simple, with no return address, but the handwriting was neat and precise. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Simon, I owe you an apology. My actions that day were inexcusable, and I've spent the past few months reflecting on what led me to behave that way. Working with the youth program has opened my eyes to the importance of respect and humility. I can never undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. Thank you for your professionalism and restraint. It taught me more than my own actions ever could. Sincerely, Jessica." Simon read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He appreciated the gesture, though he didn't dwell on it. For him, the incident was a closed chapter. His focus remained on his duties, and he carried on with quiet determination. Jessica's journey of redemption continued to unfold. As she became more involved with the youth program, her perspective broadened. She started volunteering beyond her required hours, organizing fundraisers and advocating for better resources for the program. At one event, she gave a speech about her experience, addressing the crowd with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I used to think that the world owed me something," she admitted. "I thought my actions didn't have consequences. But working here, seeing the resilience and determination of these kids, has taught me more about strength and humility than I ever knew." Her words were met with applause, and for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a sense of purpose beyond herself. As the years passed, the incident outside the palace gates became a distant memory for most, but its impact lingered. Jessica's transformation was a testament to the power of accountability and growth, while Simon's unwavering professionalism continued to inspire those around him. In a chance interview years later, Simon was asked about the incident. He paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. "People make mistakes," he said. "What matters is whether they learn from them. My job is to represent respect and discipline, and I believe those values can create change, not just in others, but in ourselves." His words resonated, capturing the essence of the journey that had begun with a single slap and ended with profound lessons for everyone involved. The story of that day became less about the slap itself and more about the growth, humility, and understanding that followed, a reminder that even the worst moments can lead to something better if we're willing to learn from them.